Hello everybody, before we get going, this is just a reminder that through the end of the month of November, all grants to the Lex Rex Institute will be matched by one of our donors who has generously offered to do that. So if you have any inclination, please make a donation before November ends and it will be matched. You can do that by visiting lexrex.org/donate. That's LEXREX.org/donate. Thanks and enjoy the show.
Look at these three words written larger than the rest, with a special pride never written before or since. Tall words proudly saying, "We the people."
Welcome to the Lex Rex Institute podcast. I'm your host, David Truschel.
And I'm your co-host, Alexander Haberbush. And today we're joined by a third person. Alex, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Alex. I am Alex's assistant. That's not going to be confusing at all for people that are only listening.
So today we're going to be discussing yet another episode in our Rome series. And Alex is sort of our resident expert on Rome, so he's here to talk to us about that.
Well, that's a little sad, considering I'm not an expert in anything, but we'll see. I guess I do enjoy the period more than most people, and I've studied it for quite a bit. It's about all I can say, though, so yeah, I'll give it a whirl.
Yeah, so this, for listeners who remember, it's actually been a few weeks now since we did the first episode in what we're calling the Fall of Rome. Get it? Because it's fall and we're talking about Rome. But This will be our second episode of probably 3 in total. Yeah, I don't really like it either, but I did come up with it, so I have only myself to blame.
Sure.
Last time we talked about... Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, somebody likes it, David.
Last time around, we talked about Roman systems of voting. This time we're going to start discussing some of the systemic and constitutional flaws that led to the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Empire. Not the one from Star Wars,
let's
but...
play our intro.
That
get
good
you in the mood?
Yeah, that good old Roman music.
Yeah, I feel like those are the wrong Italians, but that's okay. I'll go with it.
They are, in fact,
perhaps
the wrong
more
Italians.
Neapolitan. All right, here you go. So I guess our official music is just both of those now for this series.
Yeah.
What's that
sure,
second
why
one
not?
from Monty Python?
Yeah.
Oh.
What? No, that's from Ben-Hur.
Oh,
That's
I
Ben-Hur, yeah.
feel kind of sheepish now.
Yeah, it's the most Roman thing I could think of, other than maybe Respighi, but this seemed to work better.
Fair enough.
So,
Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. And, you know, I think on a previous episode, Alexander referred to Tiberius Gracchus as a proto-communist. We'll talk about whether that's completely accurate or not in a
was
bit.
it a slur? Was it accurate? That's the question we'll be answering today, right?
Yeah. But one way or
Or
another...
was it both?
Maybe so.
both.
Spoiler alert. One way or another, though, the Gracchi brothers definitely played a major role in sort of the beginning of the end, and so we'll be getting into that today. So, time period wise, we're talking about like the 130s and 120s BC, which is about 80 years before the civil war that between Julius Caesar and Pompey that ended up kind of really being the final death of the Republic. So not quite a century prior to that, but already seeing the beginning of the end.
So 100 years before the dictatorship of Caesar results in empire, right?
Before Augustus, yeah.
Just about, yeah.
No, I think almost exactly 100 years
Before the
counting
Dark
Augustus
Times.
instead of Julius, but yeah.
Yeah, before the dark times, before the empire. So. And by the way, I've not reviewed for this at all. I've been very busy doing work with my colleague John Eastman on behalf of David Eastman, no relation to John Eastman, by the way, who is an Alaska state representative who's being accused of being a member of an organization that plots the violent overthrow of the government, which is kind of apropos for what we're discussing right now. He's not a member of any such organization. It's on account of his membership in Oath Keepers, who are, of course, present on January 6th, 2021, and people are trying to get him removed from office for that. Kind of an old McCarthyist law. We talked about those in our very first episode, some California laws. Apparently Alaska's got them too. So they're currently trying to remove him from office, and that's occupied the bulk of my time, but I'm here to talk about Rome anyway. So Alex is going to be filling in as far as preparation's concerned.
Oh, good. Sure.
So, very exciting topic to begin things. We're going to be talking about land reform law in Rome.
That was always big in Rome, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of was. I was I was reading some secondary literature about this issue a couple days ago, and
Supposed to say the name, David.
I have forgotten the name, unfortunately. I didn't write it down. But
Wikipedia?
no, it was not Wikipedia. But someone remarking that it seems
Gladiator, maybe?
that it took... I don't think they talked about land reform in that movie. But
Oh, really?
someone talking about it until seemingly too late. Actually, Gaius Gracchus. No one seems to have realized that there was land outside of Italy that they could use, rather than just trying to endlessly subdivide what is ultimately a pretty small amount of land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway, Alex, do you want to tell us a bit about the Lex Agraria?
No, you go ahead.
Well, I can tell you a little bit. Okay. It's a land reform law. It went into effect in 133 BC.
I think the Lex Agraria refers to just a number of agrarian laws. The one specifically that we're talking about now under Tiberius, though, would have been to sort of break up and parcel out public land that was owned by the state of Rome. Now, the Roman state owned quite a large swath of land based on conquest in Italy before that. That was basically allowed to be used by tenant farmers of the kind that the Roman army was basically made up of. The Roman army was divided and had a requirement for property ownership and wealth. So because you basically had to buy your own weapons. So during the previous century before Tiberius Gracchus came along, Rome was obviously going around beating the snot out of everyone around them, getting really, really big, really fast. And while that was happening, the people that were conscripted into the army couldn't pay the debts on their land because you still had to give money to Rome from the land because, of course, it's not your land. You have to pay for that. If you can't do that because you're off fighting somewhere and you're not being paid until the end of your service, then the debt gets too high. And what tended to happen is that the nobles and the patricians would come in, pay the debt themselves in exchange for getting the land and kicking the families of the soldiers off the land. So there was...
Gee, that sounds all too familiar, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
so-
God, even down to the state owning a bunch of land. For those of us out in the West, we've heard of that before, right? I think more than half of our state, California, is owned by the federal government.
Yep. And then if you think of things like cowboys, that's exactly why cowboys and Indians sort of had that big ruckus of like Wyatt Earp, all that stuff. That's exactly what's going on there. Is that people were using public land, and because it wasn't their land, they started fighting over it to use more.
Yeah. Well, and then even basically elites seizing lands that someone's unable to pay for. I mean, that has shades of our Great Depression.
Yes.
When the property taxes came due on land and people weren't able to pay it. Although here it's people they conscripted into the army, so that seems to be a little bit more egregious in my view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The only reason they're not able to pay for the land and make an income is they're serving the state in a different capacity.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the situation we're looking at when we talk about the Gracchi coming in, or
Yeah.
that's what the Lex Agraria intended to reform?
Right, that's what his reforms were intended to reform, which is why when we generally talk about the Gracchi and whether or not he's a proto-communist or if it's all his fault, I think the short answer is, yeah, but don't only blame him. And the long answer is, yes, but blame other people too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's that point that I think, calls for maybe a bit of nuance rather than just blaming Tiberius, because, an element of the legal landscape was that there were supposed to be limits on how much of that public land you could actually make use of.
Yes.
It was about 300 acres in total. And because of the processes that Alex was describing, a lot of wealthy landowning families ended up holding a good bit more than that. But enforcement against them was usually, non-existent. And much like us, the Romans recognized a kind of adverse possession principle. So if you'd been improving the land, if you'd been working it, and no one had tried to assert ownership rights against you, you're at least owed compensation for being forced to give it up.
Yeah.
So initially, Tiberius Gracchus comes in and he says, all right, we'll form a land commission. We'll figure out who has too much. We'll pay them off.
Who is this guy? Just so the audience knows.
His official position, his role in the government is as a tribune, which we talked about previously. The most important thing to know about them is that they have veto powers, and the whole Roman...
And that they're elected by the people.
Yeah.
is the
yeah.
important
Yeah.
thing too.
Yeah.
That's because remember they were appointed by the popular assembly. What did you call that? The comet.
Oh, I forget.
something.
I've already forgotten the Latin.
I just call it common sense.
yeah.
Yeah, but they appointed by the people.
Right.
So he's not somebody who represents necessarily moneyed or landed interests, which makes sense given what he's advocating for. Appointed as the tribune, and as we mentioned, they had veto power,
Yes.
right? So land reform sounds like it might be exceeding that. Is that fair to say?
Well, as we've also talked about, a lot of the Roman system was pretty ad hoc, and it was, assemblies in general have legislative powers, but there's all kinds of assemblies, including the People's Assembly. And, as far as I'm aware, and Alex, you might know better than I do about this, I'm, less of a Roman history buff than you are, for sure. But I think just about anybody could propose a law at the assembly.
So okay, so
I thought you had to be a member of the assembly to propose a law.
yeah, but that just means you're a male citizen that can vote, right?
I thought once you were a tribune, you were legally no longer a part of that assembly.
I don't actually know the answer to that one.
Okay, I don't know if they had separation of powers or not. I
Not
guess that's
really.
the
They
assumption
didn't. Here's
that
the
I
thing.
made. So
Here's the thing though is that the assemblies are defined, the offices are generally defined, but beyond that, they're pretty much all running off of tradition. So the tradition definitely would be
that's
that
most
the tribunes should not be proposing laws. Whether or not it's illegal to do that, though, is probably subject to debate for them, which is why they would get into trouble because.
well, and that's most constitutions. Most constitutions historically have been unwritten, which means that they are essentially tradition. We've always done it this way. This is the way that it works. Obviously subject to confusion, subject to debate. I guess to ask my question more clearly, this is in excess of what tribunes have previously done.
Yeah.
Is that
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well in excess of what previous tribunes have done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of dubious legality.
Yes. Certainly, the Romans had what they called the mos maiorum, which, if you know the English word mores, like social mores, that's the plural of the Latin word mos. It basically just means way. So it's the way of the ancestors, basically. It's sort of the traditional way of doing things. This is definitely crossing that line.
Yeah.
But as we'll see, everyone starts doing that.
Yeah, that's sort of the
Yeah,
gauntlet.
well, and that's part of what I wanted to get at is
Yeah.
the reason why the Gracchi end up being sort of the beginning of the end is it starts an almost anything goes mindset
Yeah.
Yes,
in
definitely.
Rome. Even if they were well-intentioned, even if what they were doing was appropriate in those circumstances, you got to always be very careful when you go against the de jure way of accomplishing things because you're opening Pandora's box. Other people will start doing it
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've seen that a lot in recent days, especially with a debate about people wanting to change the composition of the Supreme Court or impeach different justices of the Supreme Court. That's not necessarily a Pandora's box we want to open. Okay, so we've set the scene. We've got a tribune of the people. He wants to propose land reform. What happens?
Yeah. Well, so as I mentioned, initially he was proposing that this be done with compensation to the people who were using the land that was to be redistributed. When, in spite of that, there's opposition, he decides, gloves come off, we're just going to take it. And so that becomes sort of the next phase of the law.
So he's a little bit of an accelerationist.
Well,
Yes.
sort of. I would actually blame more the other side for that because they did some political wheeling and dealing, and his response was, "Okay, we're going to take it, but we're going to do it legally because I have the power to veto, and you pretty much have to have approval to do almost anything, like open markets so people can buy grain, things like that, and literally anything that people need an approval for, I can veto." So he says, "I'm just going to veto everything until the Senate gives in and says we can vote on my bill, and because I know the people are behind me for it." So
That sounds very modern, doesn't it?
so I'm basically getting,
But it's a different bill than he originally proposed, right? Because it doesn't give compensation to anybody whose land is being appropriated. That's what I'm referring
that's
to.
fair.
So that's sort of negotiation 101 is that you're kind of an a-hole if you start making your terms worse just because your opponent doesn't agree with you off the bat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm calling him an accelerationist here. That is something that we will see applied time and time again throughout history is people sort of cutting off their nose despite
yeah,
their
and
face. But as far as the methods are concerned, I think you're right. I think he is acting within the law. We know that tribunes have the ability to veto things. That's all he's doing. He's saying he's not going to approve any laws until they fix the thing that he wants fixed.
Yeah, but talking about the Mos Maiorum, that smashes it with a hammer. So the traditional way is essentially like you have a period for legislation to veto. If the tribune wants to do that, that's fine. But beyond that, he usually just sits there quietly and lets the process run. The fact that Tiberius decided to do that, to use it for everything as opposed to just normal legislation, which is what they did to him. They vetoed his legislation when it was about to pass.
Didn't they have to pass? Didn't they open markets with legislation? I mean, that's maybe I'm a little bit confused here, but it sounds like he is just doing it with legislation.
That's what I'm getting at.
Because they had to use legislation to open markets.
Yeah, but that sort of thing you'd usually just like allow go. Any normal legislation, not like special things such as a land law or a new tax or things like that, you would just allow to occur because that's the normal processes of government. And that's what
that doesn't sound to me like it would violate the Mos Maiorum at all, though, because we know that tribunes have the authority to block legislation, right?
Yeah, I think what Alex is getting at is that there's this sort of again unwritten and traditional distinction between routine business and special business,
right?
And that's the sort of the custom that he's spitting in the face.
I thought the whole thing in Rome was they treated them the same way. They both required a vote.
In terms of the mechanics, I think that's true.
Right.
But in terms of the sort of unwritten rules, not so much.
Right.
So what were the additional unwritten requirements for regular legislation, I guess?
I think basically none. Everyone knows that we're going to go in here and we're going to say, oh, let's open the market. And everyone's going to say, yes, let's open the market. And then we'll be done with it.
Right. As I mentioned, keeping the markets closed hurts people that aren't rich enough to grow their own food. So, like the poor people that are voting for the land law. So that really pushed.
Well, I'm not
pushed people
talking
towards
about
the left
whether
field.
it was a good thing to do. That's whether it was a good thing for him to do. I think is a separate question from whether or not it was within his authority. I think I would have been on the side of Gracchus on that one.
Sure.
Yeah, and to be fair, no one disputed that he could do it.
Right.
That's.
I thought Alex was saying it went against the Mos Maiorum.
Well, yes, but that's unwritten custom. It's not actually,
right. I thought that was their constitution. I'm just trying to I'm trying to get down. What were the rules? What was expected?
Yeah.
What was going differently here?
Well, that's part of the problem, is that there wasn't necessarily a clean and bright line between what are the rules and what does a good proper gentleman do.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And push came to shove, what are the rules? It, turned out to be a tribune can veto almost literally anything that happens in the city of Rome.
Yeah.
But
and that was that new or was that not new?
It was new for anyone to do it because
Sure. That's not what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Was that a new power or was that an old power?
It's an old power. The law itself, the literal law never changed. It's what people did with it.
Okay.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Using established systems and methods for a purpose that was not envisioned when they were created.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would distinguish between that and changing established systems and methods.
Okay. Yeah. I think the issue is that the senatorial class tended to have a very sort of, I guess, fusty might be the right word, sort of mentality about that kind of thing.
And that is the risk of an unwritten constitution, is that I think you risk muddying the lines between what is our law and what's just stuff that we've done.
Right.
Right.
It's the same power that he's exercising here in both instances, I think pretty undebatably.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's the same power to veto opening of a market and to veto, I don't know, a new appropriations law or whatever it's going to be.
Yes.
I think that's beyond question, but the mere fact that it hasn't been done that way, you get people who are of a more traditionalist mindset saying that makes it illegal too.
Right.
Right.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because it was the establishment here also who reacted first with violence. It wasn't Gracchus, even though I agree that he was sort of a proto-communist and going about an answer to the legitimate problem. That was his answer was bad, but it was the establishment who actually started the violence when he came up for a re-election.
And that fits with our experience too. That's kind of the way things tend to go nowadays.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's the establishment is the one that doesn't like things to be mixed up too much.
Yep.
And they tend to rely on any kind of authority they can get. They don't necessarily care if it's legal authority.
Yeah. Well, we had a bit of a spoiler in that, Alex, in that this will break down into violence. But to carry things forward a bit, keep the story moving, we end up with sort of a tit-for-tat cycle of vetoes between Gracchus and another tribune who's sort of more aligned with the senators, Marcus Octavius. And so, neither of them is backing down. And that's when another sort of unheard of comes into play, which is Tiberius Gracchus gets the plebeian assembly together, and he says, you should vote to depose this other tribune, Octavius, because he's supposed to represent your will as a tribune of the people. Mm-hmm. He's not doing it. So vote him out.
And there's 2 tribunes at any given time,
10.
Right?
It started with 2, and then at some point it expanded all the way up to 10. But yeah.
So one of any 10 can veto any legislation?
At any time,
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's why I can see why vetoing things like opening of the market would be a problem, especially if people know that you can do that going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's... All right. Okay, so now, deposing a tribune, is that something that's been done before?
No.
I don't think...
That's the first time that could be done?
No, and as we talked about in the last episode about Rome, there was a religious quality to the office of tribune. They were supposed to be sacrosanct. You weren't supposed to lay a hand on them during their term.
Certainly not murdered.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we'll get to that.
So, like, of all the things that's supposed to happen to a tribune, that's like probably the bottom of the list, maybe.
But spoilers too.
Probably shortly there.
I'm just saying, this is the guy that you really don't want to get murdered because under the special protection of the gods. So I'm not saying what's going to happen to him.
Yeah.
I'm just
speaking of mixing understanding of what the law says is a power and isn't a power, because technically anything the assembly says and votes for goes. So in that sense, you can kick out a tribune.
Yeah.
But on the other sense, the gods might kill you to do it. So in that sense, you can't do it. So this is really just a big clash of 2 different concepts of what you're supposed to do in government, at least for the Romans.
Yeah, they've got formally a legislative tyranny, right?
Yes.
Legislature can do whatever the heck they want. But also, you read any ancient Roman philosophy. I mean, Cicero comes to mind, although that's written quite a bit after this, kind of in response to this in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But you see that they were certainly Aristotelian in their view of government at the time. So they certainly believe that there are limits on any governmental power. Right. They're just not built into the system.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
People are just expected to kind of be nice. You get that a lot of days from people nowadays. I mean, they say, our government won't work unless you get moral, ethical people in government. That's the ultimate safeguard. Mm-hmm. No, I mean, that's blatantly misunderstanding our founders' vision for government. People are fallible. People are flawed. You need a system that doesn't just say, well, the limits will be whatever common decency says the limits are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
okay.
This is a very good example of that idea coming up short because...
Yeah. So we've got a problem where Tiberius Gracchus is not acting like a gentleman. He's abusing his lawful power. People can't really do anything about it because everybody agrees he has veto power. So what's the solution to him acting in an ungentlemanly fashion?
Well, you do it back, but there are several steps along that path, as we'll see. So, having deposed this other tribune who is getting in the way, the land reform law does pass. Mm-hmm. So, great. Let's form a land commission, which coincidentally will be me, Tiberius Gracchus, my brother, and my father-in-law. We'll be the ones to make the decisions.
Right.
That sounds very above board. So the law passes, but then the Senate, who sort of, again, traditionally has the power of the purse, says we're not going to fund that work. Mm-hmm. So basically going to grind it to a halt.
Because he made everybody mad at him.
Yes.
So we're going to abuse the system to do what we want. We know that we have this power. We're not going to fund it. Now, has that happened before? They denied funding to a lawfully passed enactment.
That I don't know.
I don't know. In fact, I don't even know if we have a record to justify the question.
Fair enough. But it's funny because, I keep... Hopefully, our listeners are doing some of the mental math themselves here. But you can see where our system built in an expectation that people were going to act like children in this way. Mm-hmm. It's expected that sometimes the House isn't going to fund things that have been validly enacted or that the president's trying to do, and our system works when you try to do that. So that's kind of the reason we're talking about this stuff. I'm going to stop drawing our attention to it now so we can get through the rest of the story. But just keep that in mind.
Yeah. Anyway, so the Senate won't fund it, but conveniently, the king of a nearby, place called Pergamum dies without an heir, and sort of reading the writing on the wall about Roman expansion, decides better to avoid a war for my people. I'm just going to will my kingdom to Rome.
Yep.
So that happens, and Tiberius says, hey.
So the one guy who hasn't been a child so far.
Sort of, yeah.
But Tiberius says, hey, we've got all this money coming in now. Let's just take that and use it to fund this land,
Oh my
assessment
gosh.
project.
Okay. How does that money get to him? Because he doesn't exercise the authority of the Roman Empire, does he?
Well, that's
He's a
exactly what the Senate says.
See that so the will says it's my land, all the possessions, my entire kingdom goes to the people of Rome, which is the technical which is the technical title of the government of Rome.
Okay, so the people of Rome is the formal title. I've seen that before, SPQR, Senate and People of Rome. I guess that's used in some contexts. Military context?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a full context, but it's essentially Tiberius argues, it says the people of Rome, the people of Rome get to pick, and the Senate says no, he was using the official title of the government. That means the official avenues, i.e. the Senate.
Right. Well, and particularly because the Senate acts on behalf of the people.
Right. Well, they advise the people.
So they figure even if it goes to the people, that means we're supposed to administer it because we're...
Yeah.
But then the tribune is also the tribune of the people. So here's some confusion from the fact that you created an ad hoc office that represents the same people as a body that you already had representing.
Yeah. And this is also why it's a bad idea to have your constitution be unwritten tradition, where you can't go back and see did we never have this problem? I know that we don't usually have this problem, which is all that we remember.
Right. Well, and that's why our Constitution is very clear. Like, the Senate does not represent the people.
Right.
Yeah.
The House does. The Senate represents the states. The President does not represent either. The President represents the United States.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And as people confuse that all the time. They say, oh, the President represents us. No, he does not. The President represents the United States, and that's an important distinction because when things like this happen, you have to know who's in power. There was a really stupid Star Wars show that Disney released called, I think, Tales of the Jedi, where somebody makes the claim that the Jedi represent the people, and that was absurd because we know the Senate represents the people in the Star Wars Old Republic, right? The Jedi don't do that. Anyway.
So
well, they're not being careful about their writing. They're pretty good in Andor, but the other ones, they're not very good.
Anyway, but in the midst of all this, though, Tiberius, his term, which is 1 year, we talked about that, almost every Roman office, if not literally all of them, last for 1 year.
I think all but one, yeah.
Yeah. His term is up. But this business is still obviously unfinished, and he decides, hey, you know what? I need to see this through. I'll stand for re-election, which there's some dispute in the sources that I've seen about whether that was actually explicitly illegal and he was just ignoring the law, or if it was another one of these just elements of the tradition that you're not supposed to do this.
Either way, the establishment's going to be furious.
Right. And if there's one thing the Romans hate throughout their history, it's the idea of a king specifically. They have less of a problem with one man being in charge, but if you do anything that looks royal, they really don't like it.
Right.
So they like terms. Terms are good.
Yeah. And
togas are good.
Yeah. But so this looks to them, hey, this guy, he's got all the people on his side basically because he's promising them everything. He doesn't seem to care about our traditional ways, and he's trying to consolidate power into his hands. What do you do with a guy like that? Mm-hmm. Well, as it turns out, you murder him. and
like we're laughing because it's absurd, and because obviously the backlash from this is going to be horrendous. But let's look for 2 seconds. What's the alternative? Mm-hmm. If you have somebody who's really a fly in the ointment, who's abusing your systems, who's making it impossible to get things done, does our system have any built-in safeguards for that?
Wait for him to get out of office and then try to change the laws. That's about it.
And hope he's not popular.
Yeah,
right?
Get him out of. Wait till he's out of office and hope he's not popular enough to get back in.
Right, because if he is popular enough, he'll be gone for a year, and then it's all coming back.
Right. Yep. So, first Gracchus gets murdered. We have to go real quick on his brother Gaius, who about a decade later has some very similar things happen to him. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, they will also murder Gaius Gracchus, but this is the real innovation. Before they do it, the Senate passes a motion that they call Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, which basically means martial law.
Yeah.
So
that is the solution,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, within the system, other than murdering people, that's all you can do.
Yeah.
And so he, and this time, a lot of his followers as well end up being killed, whether just in the streets or later after trials for sedition, treason, or whatever.
Yeah.
But one way or another, lots of bloodshed to end the problem. But
Yeah. Now, to be fair to the Senate, neither of them were no one just walked up and said, "I'm going to assassinate you," and then stabbed them. Both of them were murdered during riots. So it's a little bit ambiguous while trying to get to the polls. So it was actually riots at poll locations that killed both of them.
Debatably, riots that they had caused.
Yeah, right. But there's more ambiguity
Yeah.
than we're saying. But it's pretty. I think no one disputes that they were murdered one way or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to be clear for our audience. What you should be noticing and what we've talked about is that the instability in the system, these riots we just referenced, everybody's anger to the point of murdering people and then eventually declaring martial law. None of that was caused by the issue of land reform.
Right.
right.
They weren't just so mad about land reform that they were going to do all this stuff. They were mad that somebody had done something that destabilized their system.
Right.
Yeah.
By going against established forms and ways of doing things, and even in most circumstances, we kind of teased this out earlier, not really even going against the system as such, but actually exposing vulnerabilities in the system.
Right.
Using the system to show why it's not a great system,
Yes.
which is actually even more of a threat,
Yeah.
right? Because you can't have that long term.
Yeah. It was more violating what the system was perceived to be. And that's, as you said, that's arguably even more dangerous because it's, showing that you've built a house of cards, basically.
Yeah. Okay, so anything else you want to say about Rome before we move on?
No, other than that this essentially exposed the contrast between tradition and law, because both sides showed that in order to protect what they cared about, they would violate traditions. Because also the Gracchi, people forget about this. The Gracchi were most politically connected family in Rome's history. They had family ties one way or the other to pretty much any famous Roman you've ever heard of that lived before them. They were one of the wealthiest families, and they decided to go reform. And the government said, "We don't care that we're tied to you by marriage, by this, like that. We're going to get rid of you because you're taking away the traditions we care about. So we're going to ignore the traditions that would help you." So both sides didn't care about tradition.
Yeah.
Only one side used the law to their advantage, and that kind of opened the door to all the problems that would come after the Gracchi. Is people saw, oh, the cat's out of the bag. I can do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, Alex, in your opinion, Tiberius Gracchus, did he act unlawfully at any point?
Tiberius, I think no. I think that his brother.
We know his brother
okay.
did, but yeah.
Yeah. We didn't have time.
I mean, that's kind of why we
full
glossed
story,
over that one a little
Right.
more, because that's. I think it's a less. I mean, it shows the way in which things degenerate.
Yeah.
And we're trying to get to the point at which things began to degenerate, and I think that's here because it's. People don't like it when you mix things up too much. We've got strong laws here. We think that our institutions prevent a lot of these different kinds of things, and we will proudly defend those institutions. Thank you so much for joining us today, Alex. Come back anytime, especially when we talk about Rome. You know more about it than
Sure,
we do.
sounds fun. Okay.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Next up, we're just going to have a brief discussion, partly because, as it stands right now, this is still just a petition for cert that's been filed with the Supreme Court. They haven't decided.
That's certiorari. Remember, they're asking the Supreme Court to hear the case.
Yeah.
So.
Which, by the time this podcast comes out, the court will have ruled on that petition, decided whether or not they're going to hear the case. We think more likely than not they won't. We can maybe talk about that in a minute, but...
Or at least they shouldn't.
Yeah, but petition for cert is in.
Usually we show you ones where we think they should take up the case. This time we're doing one where they shouldn't.
But the name of the case is Daye v. Garland, and it pertains to some immigration issues, and specifically, I think
They showing Merrick Garland or some other Garland?
it is Merrick Garland. Yep. So
Good.
Good.
Good. We've got a lawsuit against him too. That guy should get sued more often.
Yeah.
That guy's really bad. He's one of those ones that'll destabilize our system. I mean, really, he's the degree to which the Department of Justice is abusing the rule of law in this country. I mean, don't get me started.
Yeah, I won't, and I didn't. I'll I'll remind you. You did this on your own. But anyway, basically, I wanted to talk about this because I think we've used the phrase before. At least you have moral turpitude, or specifically crimes involving moral turpitude. And this case sort of centers around that issue.
Yeah.
So, long story short, this guy, Everton Daye, is an immigrant. He's from Jamaica, but he has a green card because he married an American a little over a decade ago. And he has been recommended for deportation. I think he may, in fact, have been deported at this point. But basically because he had a series of drug convictions. And those were regarded as crimes of moral turpitude. And, U.S. law on immigration allows for deportation of permanent residents, which he is, in certain circumstances, basically having to do with multiple convictions for crimes like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. And what he's arguing here is that the phrase crime of moral turpitude is unconstitutionally vague. Now, I think we've talked before about what's called constitutional vagueness. Is that something we've discussed before, David, or do you want to review that real quick?
I think we may have, but it's probably worth doing a quick refresher.
Okay. So, unlike Rome, we've got a written constitution, right? I mean, it's there in writing. You can visit it in the National Archives. You can see what it says.
Yeah. That's a pretty big advantage over the
and part of
the Roman system.
And that constitution has certain due process requirements, right? Like it says, you can't be deprived of the due process of the law.
Yeah.
So if we've got a written constitution, then if we know that constitution guarantees due process, we can make certain inferences from that, right? Which is that, our laws have to be comprehensible. Our laws have to be something that you could understand. If they're not something you understand, they violate the Constitution because they are what is called unconstitutionally vague. That's sort of the idea of constitutional vagueness. Did I explain that well?
Yeah. I think the idea being a law that isn't really, as you said, comprehensible, where you can't read it, understand what it means, and then know what kind of things you should or shouldn't do, then that's innately depriving you of due process of law, because due process entails that you understand and that it can be understood.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, part of what the law requires is the law give people fair notice of its requirements.
Yeah.
The vagueness doctrine prevents basically arbitrary enforcement, arbitrary prosecution, makes the government subject to certain structural limits. So I think it's definitely something that is required by the Constitution, even though you don't get anything in the Constitution saying laws can't be vague. I think that's a necessary inference in the fact that we have a written Constitution.
Yeah. And you can envision a scenario in which Congress passes a law. It's like no bad guys, right? And it's like being a bad guy is going to be against the law from now on. Well,
right.
How do you possibly...
Is that what crimes of moral turpitude does? That's the question, right?
Yeah. So to bring it back, the argument is basically nobody can possibly know what moral turpitude is. That's so vague. What are we doing here? You need to actually statutorily define that. That's basically what the petitioner is arguing.
Yeah, that's and considered in a vacuum. If you just look at what our Constitution says and you look at the phrase crime of moral turpitude, that might hold some water, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there's a reason that it doesn't, and that reason basically owes to the common law heritage in which the Constitution was originally written. Let me read this section from William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. William Blackstone says, "Those rights, then, which God and nature have established, and are therefore called natural rights, such as life and liberty, need not the aid of human laws to be more effectually invested in every man than they are. Neither do they receive any additional strength when declared by the municipal laws to be inviolable. On the contrary, no human legislature has the power to abridge or destroy them unless the owner shall himself commit some act that amounts to forfeiture. Neither do divine or natural duties, such as, for instance, the worship of God, the maintenance of children, and the like, receive any stronger sanction from also being declared to be duties by the law of the land. The case is the same as to crimes and misdemeanors that are forbidden by superior laws and therefore styled mala en se, or crimes in themselves, such as murder, theft, and perjury, which contract no additional turpitude from being declared unlawful by the inferior legislature. For that legislature in all these cases acts only as was before observed in subordination to the great lawgiver, transcribing and publishing his precepts, so that upon the whole the declaratory part of the municipal law has no force or operation at all with regard to actions that are naturally and intrinsically right or wrong." We talked about this earlier in reference to Rome, right? We said that it's a legislative tyranny, but there's sort of a, you gotta do some basic decency things on top of that.
Yeah.
Cicero ends up codifying that a bit more, develops really a sort of a fully developed natural law philosophy. That natural law philosophy is codified and developed over the next several millennia and does find its way into our Constitution, right?
Well, you tell me.
It does. And this is as expressed by Blackstone, as we've mentioned before, sort of the founder's Bible when it comes to what the state of the law was at the time that our nation was formed. So what do we do when we create a constitution? Well, we actually codify and enshrine certain legal rights, which recognize, in turn, that some of those rights, yes, are natural, unalienable rights, but that there are others in addition to that which don't need codification, to use Blackstone's language. We already know which crimes are crimes of moral turpitude. It doesn't have to say so in any book of laws. If it's something that seems really bad, based on our history and tradition and the laws of God and the laws of nature, that's something that would be considered a crime of moral turpitude. Does that seem too vague to you, David?
I could see someone arguing that it is, but, that's, I think, coming from a perspective that the sort of baseline idea of law is statutory law. So it has to be spelled out. There has to be legislation to, sort of confirm it. I think that's a lot of people's natural inclination nowadays. So I see where people are coming from with that. I don't think it's correct. But, I think I understand the angle. Can't say I agree with it.
Right. Fair enough. Yeah. It's the reason I think this is an important point is because, as we've mentioned before, our Constitution exists within a context. Right. It exists within a legal superstructure in which it is to be understood and interpreted. Crime of moral turpitude is not a new term. That's a term that's been around for a long, long time. You just saw William Blackstone using it. Yeah. There are certain crimes that are accepted to be a part of that. Now, I don't think ordinary drug possession is a crime of moral turpitude. I don't know what this guy did. Do you happen to know what he did?
Yeah, so ultimately it came down to possession with intent to distribute. And evidently the jurisprudence that they were relying on held that intent to distribute always has what's called mens rea, or evil mind, basically. So you always have malicious intent when there's intent to distribute, according to the
I would probably take issue with the lower court's ruling that was a crime of moral turpitude more than I would take issue with the standard.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. I'm not sure exactly what...
I don't think there is any natural duty, implied by the structure of creation and its God, or the history and traditions of the English and American people that would imply that distributing marijuana is inherently wrong.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a trickier one, but I believe that the lower court said we've got strong precedent on this and we're not going to upset the apple cart, basically.
All right. Seems like they're taking their case further than they need to. You don't need to overturn the whole crime of moral turpitude thing. Just get this one declared not to be one. And usually moral turpitude is, it's certain particularly heinous crimes. So things like murder, assault, burglary, mayhem, arson, stuff of that nature.
Yeah, which
and then
mayhem,
also
hold on one sec. Have we defined mayhem on the show before? Because I think that may otherwise strike people as odd in that list. But,
no, mayhem is a malice crime. It's the dismemberment, or it's cutting people's arms and legs off.
Yeah,
is mayhem.
So people talk
maliciously doing so.
Yeah, people talk about it was mayhem quite a lot, and I think very few people know what that actually historically means.
Fair enough. Sorry, I take that for granted sometimes. But it's crimes like that. So certain very severe, egregious crimes, and then also crimes that implicate some aspect of honesty. So things like fraud are always going to be considered crimes of moral turpitude. Yeah, falsification of documents, forgery, things like that involving dishonesty are almost always going to be there.
Yeah. I believe one of the things they were looking at in the petition was the precedent from a case, Jordan v. DeGeorge, which I think was a 1951 case, but it dealt with fraud, and the upshot of that case was that fraud was always going to be treated as a crime of moral turpitude.
Was this guy fraudulently selling drugs? What was he charged with?
No. So Daye himself, the petitioner here, was, as far as I read, the charge had to do with just bringing marijuana into the state of Virginia, evidently with intent to distribute.
So why did it matter if fraud was a crime of moral turpitude?
Because the DeGeorge case, the Jordan v. DeGeorge case, also revolved around unconstitutional vagueness, but specifically with the issue of fraud and
oh, I see. So they're saying now that it's been applied in this other instance, maybe it is unconstitutionally vague. No, I would just say they misapplied it at worst. It's not. I don't think the vagueness is at issue at all, because we have a metric by which we can determine whether or not distribution or intent to distribute drugs is a crime of moral turpitude. I don't know enough about that offhand to be able to tell you if it is. You could easily look at the history of English and American law and determine that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think we seem to have basically the same view here, that this is the wrong way to pursue this case.
Yeah. What law firm brought this?
That I don't know. I didn't make a note of that.
Not us. One of the bad ones.
Implying that that's all of the other ones, or?
No. Lots of the other ones are really good. I work with lots of the other ones, I have to say that.
Yeah. But no, seriously, there are other good ones.
Let's see. It's Eugene R. Feidel from Yale School of Law, Supreme Court Clinic. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. Yeah, this is somebody who's not terribly familiar with probably originalism, frankly.
Yeah.
Because they're ignoring the common law history of our Constitution. So I think it's very plain in Blackstone. Crime of moral turpitude is absolutely a constitutional category. You can use it.
Yeah, and I think we may have mentioned this before, but there, some organizations, and it sounds like this may be one of them, that sort of really specialize in Supreme Court issues, tend to take real big swings to try to, fix what they perceive to be pet issues. And I wonder if this may be, one of their axes to grind. Is this
with the fact that our Constitution is based on a common law heritage?
What I meant, vagueness is what I was getting at, but but
well, I think unconstitutional vagueness is actually a real problem with a lot of our laws.
Yeah,
I don't think the ones that are rooted in common law heritage are the ones that have that issue.
Right.
There's lots of rulings on this stuff. There have been thousands of rulings over the centuries about what constitutes crime of moral turpitude. It's very easy to look at that stuff.
Yeah.
It takes a while because you have to do legal research on it. That's why I don't know offhand. I don't know every one of those 1,000 cases.
Right.
But I don't think that's the right target. I think usually written laws are a better target for unconstitutional vagueness when it's very unclear what kind of conduct they intend to prohibit or require.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so as we mentioned, between us recording this episode, because, the Supreme Court is due to decide whether they'll hear this case or not between now and when this episode will be released. So who knows, by then they may have already thrown it out, they may have accepted it, but, we'll see, I guess. But anyway.
All right, gather around, boys and girls, young and old, everybody interested in American law, law throughout the ages, law throughout the world. It's once again time for Captain Kangaroo Court.
Okay, well, we are once again pushing our time limits, so I will once again try to make this pretty quick. I've got another pair of themed stories for you, but this time we're going a bit of a different direction. We're going to be talking about defendants that are not actually animate persons. So there's an ancient Greek writer named Pausanias who basically writes travel stories. So all the places he's going, interesting things he's seen. He tells one story about a statue of an Olympic athlete named Theagenes, who was, evidently had an athletic rival who was bearing a grudge even after he was dead, so he liked to go out at night and beat up the statue. Don't know why.
Of the dead guy?
Yep. Couldn't tell you why.
Beat up a dead guy. It's hard to beat up a statue. Usually it's going to beat you up, It's
well,
your fists.
And in fact, that's what happened, at least according to Pausanias. I'm pretty sure this story never actually happened, but, who knows.
But you can't be sure.
Yeah. One night, evidently, he hits it so hard that eventually the statue breaks and falls on him, and he dies. And his sons, being very upset about this, decide they want to sue the statue.
They sue the estate of the guy that...
Nope, they just sue the statue.
Does the statue have assets?
I don't think it does, but this may be one of those circumstances where it was sort of a hero cult type thing. So maybe the argument here is the statue has some kind of life in it, something magical, whatever. But allegedly, they put the statue on trial. The city convicts the statue of murder, and they decide to throw it into the ocean.
How is that murder? It wasn't even acting.
Well, that's where I think maybe they thought, well, his spirit made the statue fall over or something. Who knows?
He probably didn't say much in his defense.
I doubt that he did, yeah.
I doubt he was able to hire competent counsel. Maybe it was a default judgment, since it was a civil suit. He never responded to the complaint.
Yeah. Well, eventually, the oracle comes to his defense and basically says to the city, you're having all this famine, and it's because you threw that statue into the ocean, so you better go fish it out. And that's allegedly what happens.
All right, then.
Yeah. So that's
pretty weird.
That's our first inanimate defendant.
So was it you said he was convicted of murder. Was it a civil suit or was he criminally prosecuted?
I don't know very clearly. I'm guessing that this Pausanias guy probably didn't either. I don't think he had great working knowledge of the law. At any rate, the story he tells is very weird, and I'm not sure what to make of it. Other than that, I like
to imagine they just got a default judgment against him. They served a complaint on this statue, just kind of left it there on the ground, and then went back to the judge. And then a month later, when he hadn't responded, they filed for a default judgment.
Yeah, that may have been a better strategy than what they actually did. But anyway, in our second story. This one I think you probably have heard of before, you specifically. But
oh, yeah. This one's well known.
Yeah. The Cadaver Synod, it's called, where the Pope put the last Pope on trial after he was dead. So this is happening back in the 9th century. Pope Stephen VI comes into office, having been involved in a very contentious dispute with his predecessor. Before that, all kinds of politics involved. We'll spare you the details, but he wants to sort of undo all the things that the previous Pope Formosus had done. One of the ways you can do that is by, obtaining a legal judgment that he had never legitimately been the Pope. So they dig up his body, they stick it in a chair, and they accuse it of having usurped the papal office. Lo and behold, the body doesn't really answer much in return.
What do you say in your defense? Just like that statue, he says nothing.
Yeah. As this I learned when I was reading about this.
I like that they're that opposed to hearing him in absentia that they have to dig up his body. We're going to actually observe the proper formalities. We're not going to have somebody heard in absentia, but we're going to exhume his body to hear it. That's just nuts to me.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I didn't know this before prepping for this show. The Pope actually did appoint someone to speak on his behalf. I'm not sure that guy felt like it was in his best interest to do a very good job of it, so he probably didn't.
Yeah, his client's probably not going to get mad at him if he doesn't. So,
long story short, they find him guilty. This was another detail I didn't know until very recently, but I'd heard this story before. They end up throwing his body into the Tiber River, but this part I had not heard before. They actually cut off the fingers of the corpse that are used in the gesture of blessing, the thumb and the first two fingers, as, part of the symbolism here, that he was never actually the Pope, so he could never actually have conveyed a blessing on somebody. So,
wow.
Pretty grisly.
So if you look at the list of the popes now, is he not on it?
That's a good question. There are...
Or I don't know, do canon lawyers consider this valid precedent or not?
That's an excellent question. I don't know that. I do know that the new Pope, Pope Stephen, he doesn't last very long either, and he ends up being executed as well. So, there are disputed accounts of the sort of, the proper sequence of popes. Yeah. So
that would seem to be a real problem if you hold to the view that it's got to be a direct lineal line from Peter. Yeah.
Well, and that if you could be posthumously removed as Pope, then no one's ever truly safe, are they?
No. I guess maybe Peter, but other than that, I don't know. All right, well, I guess that's it for Captain Kangaroo Court. So thanks, folks. That's hopefully you learned a little bit about the weird, wacky, wonderful world of dead people and statues standing trial.
Yeah.
I don't know that it's terribly practical, but it is something.
If you ever find yourself
join us again next week.
Needing to sue a statue or a corpse, you can look back on these precedents.
No, don't call us. We're not going to help you with that. That's not what we do.
All right. That'll do it for us, but stick around.
It's time that you've been waiting for the whole episode. Time to hear the disclaimers.
Exactly. All right. Thanks, folks. Please Please note that nothing in this podcast constitutes legal advice, and all of the opinions expressed are the opinions of the individuals expressing them, not necessarily the opinions of the Lex Rex Institute.
The Lex Rex Institute is a nonprofit constitutional advocacy organization. If you'd like to learn a bit more about our organization's activities or make a donation, please visit our website, www.lexrex.org, LEXREX.org.
As a reminder, this podcast is a legal issues podcast, not a political issues podcast. We try to keep our commentary strictly to legal issues. Today, now that more issues are considered political than ever before, we believe it's especially important to distinguish between the two.
Thanks for listening to the Lex Rex Institute podcast, and we'll see you again next week.